Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Marga. Just want to say a big shout out to all of you who are joining us from different parts of the world. It's great to see those of you coming on the chat function. Daniel, thank you so much. Your work, your family has been so much a part of the work that I do, and it's just great to see you here. It was such a thrill to see that you were the sponsor today. I want to thank Kiana as well and make a note that I'm actually speaking to you from the Wasnik, Tulalip, and Chemainus people's ancestral lands. I'm actually in Point Roberts, which is just on the other side, on the US side of the border from Tawasin. And, but my home is the west end of Vancouver. So I just want to acknowledge that and say thank you, Kiana, for such a beautiful way of opening. So I want you all to take a moment and think back to that time when we got the notice of lockdown. Okay, for me and Simon Fraser University, that came March 16th. And if my counting is correct, that's 200 days ago today. Okay, so I want to ask you how you felt at that moment. Did you feel excited? Was it overwhelming? Did you feel like anxious? Were you calm? Were you scared? I remember that I actually felt deeply calm and focused at the beginning. I thought, okay, you know, working in Afghanistan, working in conflict and pre-conflict zones, I embrace ambiguity. I love those moments. And I thought, okay, this is a time when I feel like it's time to step in. I also want to say I felt very fearful and concerned because that conflict background as well made me realize that things can turn on a dime at any time. We can go from everything's fine to not fine very quickly. So my fearful, scarce self went to the bank, took money out, and hid it inside my house. I want to go back to the calm side because what did I do? Well, the first thing we did, and I know that there's some of my colleagues on the call, we sat down together and we looked at who was precarious, who were the people working at the Morris J. Wass Center for Dialogue, who were on contracts or short-term. First thing we did is we went to them and said, we got your back, you're fine. You're going to continue to be working. We're not stopping contracts at this moment in time. The second thing is said that whatever we were doing yesterday is not what we're going to be doing tomorrow. Things have changed. And while we're a people-facing, relationship-focused space that's used to in-person dialogues, that's not what we're going to be doing. We gotta pivot, we gotta move. And so what we did is we sat down and we looked at what was an overarching theme that would get us to where we wanted to go. And we decided that whatever we were going to do was going to be driven by an overarching goal that we were driving for a more inclusive, more democratic, and more resilient society. That whatever we did had to lead to that. Then if you've studied complexities, you know what minimum specification is. What are those things that are core, that can't be compromised, that have to be in place? Well, that's when we sat down and we looked at, okay, we are a center for dialogue. So what we do has to promote dialogue. We also fundamentally believe in racial equity and justice. So we want to be driven by an understanding of advancing racial equity and justice. And we also want to be driven by an ethic of care, caring for others, but also caring for ourselves and the community in which we work. Now, once we had that, we said, okay, go and innovate and recognize we are not going to get it all right. We're going to experiment. We're going to get some things wrong, but we're going to learn. But you don't have to come back to ask to do things. Step up and step in. So here are some of the ways in which we innovated. Well, our theme's on transit, and I thought I'd start with the transportation. We recognized in that first week in our region in Metro Vancouver that people didn't know if they could drive. They didn't know if it was safe to get on transit. They didn't know if it was okay to walk or get on your bike. Nobody really knew what to do. So I turned to one of the most brilliant creative minds that I work with, Jude Crasta, and I said, Jude, we got to step up. We got to step into the situation. And so in 24 hours, Moving in a Livable Region was this website that was created. So that first innovation that Jude put together in 24 hours, a slide, and if you look at the COVID-19, it was a website, a kind of go-to portal for people trying to figure out how to move with COVID. The second thing is I work at a center with a lot of young people. I'm at a university, Simon Fraser University, and a lot of youth were asking questions about school, about socializing, health, and they didn't know where to go. So again, this group of young people led by one of our heads of our democracy project, Jen Wolowick, got together and said, we got to figure out how to support young people through this. And so again, Jude created a website, and that's the next slide, on We Got You. And that was really a website to really look at how do we help young people figure out how to navigate in this space. A third innovation. We are, as I said, a center for dialogue. So how do you have dialogue in this space? And we worked with SFU Public Square, this incredible, innovative public engagement center within SFU, and with our partners at City Hive, which is an awesome youth organization working in our city. And together created a whole series called Distance Not Disengaged. And that's a monthly online salon that addresses issues in our community. And that's the next slide, Mark. So all of these initiatives, and you can go off the slides, Mark, have something in common. And that's that staff stepped up. They stepped up because we were a university that didn't retrench. Even though we knew that things might be a problem, our university said, no, get out there and go and serve community. And that encouraged us and gave us the support to do that. So an institution making a commitment to engagement. So now I want to go back to that side of me that has worked in pre-conflict and conflict situations. And if any of you have, if you've lived through conflict, if you've fled conflict, you know you're constantly scanning the horizon. You're looking for those places where fear and scarcity take hold. Because when fear and scarcity take hold, it's like a virus. It can move quickly. So by the end of March, I was scanning the horizon of Vancouver, and I was getting very seriously concerned of what was going on in our downtown Eastside. For those of you who don't know our downtown Eastside, it's kind of at ground zero on the opioid poisoning crisis. There's just so much that's going on in terms of the opioid poisoning situation. 96% of our drug supply is poisoned, and people are dying. So what was happening there is that as our movements were really restricted, so too was the drug supply. So street drugs were becoming harder to get, and the prices were going up. Now, if you've got a health issue, if you've got an addiction issue, high prices, low supply can create a perfect storm. So when I was looking at what was going on, and we had so many of our offices, our businesses, that there were no people in them. They were emptied out because we were all at home. And I was really worried about looting. I was worried about people doing desperate acts to try and get supply. And that for me was one of the most volatile situations in our city at that moment. So what happened? And again, people stepped up. We had, and I know a number of you from Creative Mornings were in part of this, the Downtown Eastside Response Network created a fund. It started with getting soap for people in the downtown Eastside, and it became a crowdfunding platform to support people on the front lines. Also in late March, finally, our health officials started to deal with the issue of safe supply of drugs. We started to get provincial action on that. And people in the downtown Eastside, people like Sarah Blythe and others, started to get the word out because they realized how vulnerable residents were. And they started to work through peer-to-peer outreach, through public art like Smokey D's mural here, to get the word out about COVID-19 to community there. Similarly, now in a lot of communities, business associations can be really kind of quite conservative folks. not in the downtown Vancouver area. They, instead of calling the police and bringing on more security guards, they called artists instead, muralists, and said, listen, come work. Let's take all these boarded windows and create centers of artwork. So those were beautiful ways in which artists, community frontline workers, some of the folks of Creative Mornings stepped up. So what was it that all of these things had in common? And for me, people stepped in with love and compassion and creativity. They helped to transit us from a place of scarcity and fear to a place of collective well-being. And we saw that over and over again with individuals, with teams, with institutions. But what happens when you don't act in that place? What if you do go to a place of scarcity and fear? And again, I want to use a couple of illustrations of that. In Vancouver, by April, our transit authority, TransLink, was facing a really difficult situation. It was a bleak future. We had loss of gas tax, loss of transit fees. In fact, our transportation was going bankrupt. And we were on the risk of using one of the most important social infrastructure pieces of our society, our transit system. And so what did TransLink did? They did everything they could, and they led with a public campaign that really talked about bankruptcy. We're bleeding, we're losing jobs, we're going to have to close down. And I think the feeling was that if people knew what was going on, they would act. But they didn't really act. So they came to us and said, how can you help us? And we looked at it and we said, that's a place of fear. You're speaking from a place of scarcity. We want to do it differently. So Moving in a Livable Region said, hey, we got this. First thing we want to do is we want to thank our government for having our back so far. And we want to say, in the same way that you stepped up, you've supported our frontline workers, you've supported our first responders, TransLink is critical as an essential service. It's what gets our frontline workers to work. It's what is absolutely essential for responding to this crisis and helping us get out. So we led with a different campaign, which really thanked government. And we worked with our mayors. We lobbied hard. And to the credit of our provincial and federal government, to the credit of our local mayors, we got the funding. And transit wasn't closed down. In fact, it's still going on. And we are using it, and people are using it as well. Another example of scarcity to collaboration. One of the things that was really hard was on March 16th, and we'll go off the slides here if that's okay, is that we closed our civic facilities, our libraries, our community centers were closed on March 16th. And I understand why we did that. Staff were fearful. They work in public-facing institutions. They didn't know if it was safe. The city was talking about bankruptcy. They closed. But in closing, we lost one of the most important parts of our social infrastructure, our civic infrastructure, and what's necessary in creating the resilience in our cities, our civic commons. So in the absence of libraries and community centers being there, what happened? Well, new civic assets emerged. People started to step up and offer help. Our Buy Nothing groups, our COVID Coming Together Facebook groups started to pop up all over the city. Hey Neighborhood, an initiative started by Michelle Hoare, started to help buildings come together. Rory Richards, this amazing organizer, brought the 7 p.m. cheer to the West End, and that spread throughout the city. So we were cheering our healthcare workers like they were in cities around the world. And people started stepping up. The knocks on the door if you were quarantining saying, can I get you anything? Can I take out your garbage? In virtually every corner of our region, people started to step in. That was moving from scarcity to collaboration. But here we are 200 days later. I wonder how many of us who stepped up and stepped in, how many of us kept that going? How many of us could sustain that energy? The reality is that scarcity and fear is real. People are dying. We have the worst opioid poisoning crisis in our city. Friends are getting sick. They're not recovering. Our schools are opening, and we don't really know if they're safe. So for many of us, it's overwhelming. And I know it was for me. After supporting the center, after supporting our university in our COVID response, after teaching 40 hours a week for 7 weeks, caring for my father, watching him die, trying to celebrate him when we couldn't come together as a family, I hit the wall. I couldn't keep going. I had to step back, and I had to let others step in. You know, COVID is here to stay. And if you're one of those people that follow the scenario building activities, you'll know that the long emergency scenario is the most robust right now. We're living through a long emergency. Think of the fires, think of the smoke. COVID's one part of it. And in living through a long emergency, we need to know when we ebb and when we flow. Sometimes we really need to know when we need to shore up our energies, take care of ourselves, ask for support, and let others lead. Other times, when we have the energy, when we have those creative juices flowing, we have the capacity to give, we need to step in. So understanding when we need to ebb and flow as individuals, understanding it as teams, understanding it as institutions in our families is critical. You know, we talk about IQ, emotional, or intelligence quotients. We talk about emotional IQ, emotional intelligence. We talk even about cultural intelligence. Well, I want to introduce a new concept, one that I think is going to be so extremely important as we face this long emergency, and that's RI, our resilience intelligence. RI is the ability to face ambiguity and to be very open to trying new things. It's, as Daniel says, it's listening to the needs of others and ourselves. It's understanding when to ebb and when to flow. Resilience intelligence recognizes that we are working in a place of complexity. We neither can predict what's next, nor is there a high level of consensus of how to move forward. So we have to build our collective intuition. RI relies on creating spaces of learning, experimentation, being open to inspiration, creativity, and stepping into collaboration. I think people who build RI muscles generally recognize the value of diverse thinking. We recognize that we know and can transition ourselves and our communities away from thinking that mindset with the cup is half empty to a cup is half full. I expect if I did an analysis of you, of this creative morning communities, I would see very high levels of RI. I know you embrace ambiguity and creativity and complexity because you can show people other possibilities. We can think about the future. We can imagine new realities. I want to close with a very recent illustration of RI, and it comes through Mountain Equipment Co-op. If you're in the United States, REI is a kind of equivalent. Now, Mountain Equipment Co-op was created by a group of varsity outdoor students at UBC in 1971. And in almost 50 years, it has grown to a cooperative that sells $450 million and has 22 stores across the country. That cooperative is about to be sold to a US capital, tiny US capital firm in a fire sale that doesn't care about us, doesn't care about the co-op values, and certainly doesn't care about outdoor retail. You know, when we learned about this as members, we were devastated, angry, and ranting. And as a former board member and treasurer, I was enraged. But I have to say those feelings were short-lived. Our RI muscles kicked in, and we attempted to do the impossible and put forward a member-driven alternative deal. We went to court on Monday. At 9:30, in one more minute, the judge is going to bring down their announcement today. We got over 140,000 people signing commissions. We raised over 40 million in equity, plus commitments for another 100. There were hundreds of people involved, people I never saw, people who are working the phones, people getting money, people dealing with the legal case, campaigning the banks to give us more time, working social media outreach. It should have been a chaotic, ranting mess, but it wasn't. Instead, we stepped up. We stepped in the same way that the West End Buy Nothing Network stepped in when a single mother, a new immigrant, having a baby, needed support and care and provided 2 to 3 weeks of continual food and clothing. The same way that community choir leader Vanessa Richards stepped up when she led the Black Lives Matter protest with a COVID-safe humming of Amazing Grace. And the same way artists have in Vancouver, in the murals that they've painted and the mural festival they just put on. COVID-19 may be with us for a while yet. And while we face climate change, the devastation of the fires, the infestations, the floods that are absolutely ravaging some of our communities, I know we're going to get through because we have the capacity to respond. By knowing when to ebb and when to flow, by tapping into that creativity, by leading with compassion and love, by exercising those resilient muscles, we transit from a place of scarcity to a place of collaboration and collective well-being. We are resilient. Thank you.
Hi. Well, thank you very much, everyone, CreativeMornings and Shauna, for the talk. It was really meaningful. I had a question. In many projects I've been doing, like community level, even if it's like community based in a specific city or like more on a national level, during this time, I feel it's really hard to keep the equilibrium between people filling out their individual need while keeping a momentum of something collective. So I wanted to know if you had like any advices or what is your thinking about how do we keep a collective momentum while making sure we have a self-care culture going.
Merci, Pierre-Antoine. Thanks, it's great to see you. So I think that's an interesting question. And I think the recognition that this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, and that we need to look at who we're working with collectively and check in and get to know, take the time to get to know each other a little bit. One of the things, just knowing on a day-to-day basis who's a morning, afternoon, night, so that you can feed off of where your strengths are, so we're not depleting each other's energy, but always working in one way. So recognizing there are diverse ways of working, different people need different things, designing processes of collaboration that enable people to be themselves in those, but also listening really carefully for when people say they need something. And sometimes it's their body will know before their mind does. And so when people start to be getting sick a lot, watch that as a cue. When you're hearing, for me, when I start in my own mind getting a little victim narrative, like, I'm working, I don't get any times or breaks. Like there's this little victim thing that goes on. I know that that's a sign for me that there's something going on that I need to take, I'm out of balance. So listen for those things that suggest that you're out of balance and really acknowledge that it is okay for people not to be always giving. You can't always give. This is a marathon. And I think resilience, I mean, I did really sit and think about what resilience intelligence is. And it is that knowledge of myself that I will need to take times away, but that's not a permanent state for me. I know I can come back in. Like right now, I got energy to give. And so that we don't see ourselves in these boxed in places, that it's a give. So it really is an ebb and a flow, that there is this space. Merci beaucoup pour votre question.
Great.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Shauna, she had to leave, but Sue Bealey asks this question. How do we support our youth in developing the capacity to hold ambiguity?
That is a fantastic, and Sue is in the small group with me, so she had some fantastic things to say too about how not to get into reacting, but to take the time to think and to respond. So that was a beautiful Sue Bealey comment. So right now at the Morris J. Wass Center for Dialogue, we have taken on a youth program called Pivot 2020. So we actually have 1,300 young people that have stepped in, and there may be some of them on the call today, and it's such an amazing initiative. I think young people have perhaps a better sense of ambiguity than I do. And one of the things that I learned a number of years ago was to take a network-based approach, to actually really start to work in a networked way, which is actually a way that works within complexity thinking. If you think of complexity as a place where we have to try different things, that we need to use intuition, trial and error, a networked approach is one that young people feel so much more comfortable with. So it is true that I mean, I probably am one of those helicopter parents who created a situation where I wanted my child to have, all the things I didn't have. And maybe the resilience wasn't as great as it might have been for those of us that were raised without the things but there's a different kind of resilience that I'm learning from young people. The kind of resilience that comes from building networks of support online, building, being vulnerable, stepping up and being vulnerable and saying, hey, I need support. I see that far greater. So I think there's as much to learn from young people about ambiguity as it is around us sort of talking about resilience. So it's a give and take for me.
Awesome. Anybody else?
There was a question earlier, Marga, and Allison asked it, and it's a really, really important point. And Allison, with your permission, I'm going to come back to it because she asked the question. Interesting that at the beginning, when what was going on the downtown east side, I was worried about looting, not worried about vulnerable people not being able to even wash their hands. And I want to raise that because Allison is right. That is the first point of concern. And so we don't often think about what is going on for people who are living in vulnerable situations. And that is so critical as we're looking about how we react. I was looking from a conflict situation of all those places where I was looking where fear and scarcity can create dynamics that can go throughout a city and move very quickly to conflict. That's what I was looking at. But Allison, you're dead right. That is your starting point. People in the downtown east side couldn't even get the basics of clean washrooms, places to be safe. And that's huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something that in our pod we were talking about the fact that we're in this together, but our privilege is having us have a different experience from it. Like, we have ways to have community engagement through our computers. Many people don't even have that ability, right? Like that is a privilege that we have and we take for granted in this whole process. But the fact is that there are so many that don't have even the basics of what they require, and it's just so overwhelming, right? So yeah, definitely. There was Tessica
Jessica,
also. Yeah, she had a question. I don't know if Tessica wants to come
Oh,
forward.
please, Jessica.
Yeah,
First
yeah,
of all,
sure.
let's all applaud Tessica, because Tessica took the step to go and run for public office.
yeah, she did.
I can't be more impressed with you taking that step. That takes courage. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Shauna, and I really appreciate you saying that, especially because I look so much up to you. For those of you who don't know, I used to work at SFU Public Square under Shauna, and it was really inspired by her mayoral race as well. And the question that it actually came up in our pod, and I think it was similar to that question just around giving, like where do we someone mentioned that they had worked on your campaign, and they were just really touched by how you're always in such a place to give. And I know, I think maybe that's like what you can see from the outside, because we talked a lot today about the ebb and flow and when you can give and when you can't. But just how do we build that muscle, that question around, and how do we build that resilience as well? Because for some of us, you know, we go through challenging times a lot in our lives, and for some of us, this might be a new experience. Whereas, you know, I had been hearing from a lot of folks that actually we've been going through pandemic-like times for a long time. You know, especially on in places where they don't have access to a lot of the healthcare supports that we have, and finally, and so it's been a difficult time for many of us, and it continues to be as well.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Tessica. You know, I used to rebel against my mother when I was young, because I was raised, if anybody knows me, I was raised in an extremely sexist household. You know, the three boys, their education was paid for. My sister and I know, and you know, I think I've told this story before. My dad used to say to me, you know, if you really work hard, Shauna, you can become a secretary. And my sister and I were sent off to take care of our aunts, basically anyone that needed care. From like the age of 11 on, we were sent off to care for people. So I rebelled hard against that. I rebelled against my mother. I rebelled against that having to be the caregiver. Really didn't like it. And it was about a year ago, someone asked what your superpower is. And I thought it was a stupid question, to be honest. I'll be really honest. I thought, superpower, God, please. But then I sort of deeply, I kind of went through this kind of deep personal reflection. And I started to realize that it was what my mother had given me first and foremost, that people and relationships matter. Like that's at the core, they matter. And showing up as a caregiver is absolutely critical. And if we could more of us show those sides of us, that we could talk about care, that we could talk about leading policy from an ethic of care, how different this world would be. So rather than rejecting that side of myself, I realized, you know, I'm more like my mother than I'd like to give. I want to embrace that. I want to learn from it. I want to learn the core competencies you get as a caregiver in our society, and to bring that and to look at how that can shape our policies, our procedures, the way we work, the way we show up, not just in terms of how we show up in institutions and in our communities, but how we show up for the planet as well. So for me, that ethic of care is a big part of my notions of resilience as well. And it's something that is really, really important.
Awesome. We have another question from Jonathan. He raised his hand. So let's see the guy.
Hi, Shauna. Good to see you again. Always, I just mentioning that I really miss our chats. It was so nice to hear your voice again. And as many already alluded to, there's a certain sense of calm and leadership that you bring to so many conversations. So it's nice to hear that reflected. As always, you bring many great points to consider and also tools to learn and grow from. But the one that jumped out the most was that reminder of that we actually need to give ourselves permission to be selfish, that permission to go back to the well, replenish ourselves so that we can actually be the best person we can be for others. And so many people on this call or on this show want to help and want to give and they want to be generous. But at a certain point that becomes depleting and erosive, and that ebb and flow that you cautioned people with is also that reminder that we need to be the best we can be so that we can honestly be that source of energy and motivation for others. So the question is, you mentioned the networking aspect, you mentioned the power of youth and vulnerability and finding online places to do that. What do you do, or what is one of the tools you use personally and in your inner sanctum and circle to help strengthen that resolve, or how do you place that?
Thanks, John. And it's great to see you. You know, my partner, and it's his birthday today, happy birthday, Steve, tells me I'm probably the most impatient person he's ever met in his life. And the other day, we were sitting in the backyard. We don't have the most beautiful backyard in Point Roberts. We're slowly trying to do things. And he said, "You are watching the plants grow. You keep doing this." And I said, "I know, I am," because I've taken up gardening. If you talk to anybody at the Morgewa Center for Dialogue, they'll know that I kill most plants. I try not to, but I do. But now I'm taking up gardening, and it's really helping me find patience and calm and centeredness. I'm also really trying to not be in spaces where I'm constantly doing. I want to do that in my work, but when I'm off work, I try and stay away from work. Like that it's not that I'm doing other things. I'm getting to know my neighbors. I'm trying to show up in this community of Point Roberts that's going through such a hardship right now because of COVID, even though there are no cases here. It's devastated this community in terms of the businesses. So I'm trying to show up. I am trying to be there for my nieces and my own family, and just so for me, it's taking time, it's taking silence, it's watching the plants grow, it's digging in the dirt, and it's also showing up in a different way for other people.
We're starting to lose our crowd as we hit the top of the hour. We just have a few more minutes, so let's go ahead and pull Charles. I think Charles had a question for you.
Sai.
Yeah.
Charles Sai, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Hi, Shauna. So, I mean, I was struck by your use of the term long emergency, and I think it really gave me pause. And, you know, for a lot of us, we do, I think, start to think about what we're going through as more than just a short-term thing. But, you know, so in this kind of moment, how do we, and especially young people, how do we begin to see where the new opportunities are, and where can Canada begin to see, you know, what meaningful work can emerge during this time, and how to guide people towards that kind of work rather than just simply try to hang on to the kind of work that we used to do.
Oh, I love it, Charles. And welcome back to Canada. I know Charles has been traveling all over the place and finally got back home. We worked together many, many years ago. So I would say, Charles, that for me, this is such a moment, a creative moment, right? Like we have an opportunity. We hear build back better. I love somebody said bold back better, but we have this is a moment of transition. This is a moment of stepping in with new ways, new visions of thinking, and asking for it. You know, I'll go back to the very beginning of that first stimulus package from the federal government. I was part of a group. John Schell is this guy he's fearless in pushing for things that he thinks are important. And we were all very concerned that that very first stimulus package was going to come back with, loans to banks. And so pushed so hard on, this is the moment we need to support precarious workers. This is the moment that what is more important than anything else is to ensure that people aren't left, and that we need to also support Main Street businesses, that, the small businesses that are dying. And I was so impressed in that very first stimulus package that where they were going was the banks, and they turned it around. And that's where they went. And then CERB was created for all its imperfections. But look around the world, the way we showed up in that very first instance. So this is a moment of transition. And if you look at the throne speech, they said they were going to take out all the green transitions. If you looked at what the infrastructure bank announced yesterday, we're getting green transitions. We are getting investments finally into the clean energy sector. So we do have a chance to transition. What we need to do is keep up the pressure around racial equity and justice, transform our institutions so they are more racially equitable and just. We need to move to more, I'm not going to be afraid of using the word democracy. Democracy is under attack. I'm defending democracy. I'm going to stand forward. I'm going to continue to push on those things. This is the moment when we do need to present alternative ways of being. It's not going back. We're not snapping back. We are going to a place, and I want to go back. I want to go to that better place.
Okay, that there couldn't have been a better way to end. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm unmuting everybody for some applause. Ready?
Yes.
Everybody unmute.
Thank you so much, Shauna.